This podcast is recorded at the University of Sydney's Camperdown campus, on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. They've been discovering and sharing knowledge here for tens of thousands of years. I pay my respects to elders past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people.
Here we are at a local supermarket. We're about to walk through the fruit and veggie section into the centre aisles of the supermarket, which is UPF territory. So here we are in the cereal aisle. These are the common breakfast cereals that Australians eat every day. And we will start with rolled oats that you make porridge from, which are minimally processed, which are probably the best thing you can put in your bowl. But we move down the cereal aisle to a packet of Nutrigrain. Claims on the front, it says real nourishment, protein, iron, fibre, multigrain and B vitamins, and it has a 4.5-star health star rating. And then we flip it over to look at the ingredients, and it's about as ultra processed as you can possibly get. Flavours, emulsifiers, maltodextrin, pack full of sugar, protein isolates. It's over 25% sugar. So mums and dads, they're thinking these are healthy options, but not really, not at all.
What's Australia's national diet?
Now here we are in the bread section, and the breads that you can see right in front of us are mostly ultra-processed.
If I ask you what's eaten in Italy or Japan, you probably have a pretty clear picture in your mind. Here in Australia, we've got a few national favourites, but what's our cuisine?
It's got a 4.5-star health rating. This contains wheat flour, as you'd expect from bread, but it's also got modified tapioca starch, wheat gluten, canola flour, soy flour, vegetable emulsifiers. And
if you ask Dr. Phillip Baker, he'll give you the bad news. He says Australia's national diet is ultra-processed. More than half of what Australians eat now is classified as ultra-processed foods, which are linked to a slew of ill health effects, including cancers and other diseases. The companies making these foods are spending billions on marketing and lobbying, and researchers are saying they're putting global health at risk in a similar way to big tobacco. You've probably heard of ultra-processed foods, or UPFs, but what exactly are they, and how can you spot them at the supermarket? What do they do to humans when consumed in excess? And if they're so bad for us but so profitable for manufacturers, how do we reverse this trend? Associate Professor Phillip Baker is an Australian Research Council Future Fellow and a University of Sydney Horizon Fellow. He's one of the co-leads of a major new Lancet series on ultra-processed foods, a comprehensive look at the science, the politics and the policy responses to what might be one of the biggest global health challenges of our time. This is The Solutionists. I'm Mark Scott. Phil, what exactly is ultra-processed food? What are we looking out for when we're at the grocery store?
So the starting point for answering this question is to say that humans have been processing food for thousands and thousands of years. So we would grind grains to make a porridge or make bread. We ferment foods to make yogurt. We churn milk to make butter. We dry foods. This is part of who we are. And in fact, processing food has led to the growth development of entire civilizations. It's our ability to store food, to make it more nutritious, to give cultural meaning to food, the creation of all these diverse cuisines that we see all around the world. That all comes from processing food. Now, ultra-processed foods came about just in the last 100 years or so, but especially from the 1950s onwards. And these are industrial formulations which are very different to other types of processed foods. Now, the point of difference is that they contain ingredients that have been extracted from these agricultural commodities. Here I'm talking about commodities like soy, like palm oil, like wheat, sugarcane, for example. These ingredients are combined to create these ultra-processed food products that contain very little whole food. So that's a characteristic of these ultra-processed foods. Now, a rule of thumb is that these foods contain ingredients that you would not use in your own kitchen at home. So if you're in the supermarket and you pick up one of these products and you turn it over and you look at the ingredients list, you will see the ingredients like protein isolates. You will see colorings, flavorings, emulsifiers. These are industrial ingredients. And the other thing to say about ultra-processed foods is that the purpose is to maximize profitability. So you use these cheap commodity ingredients that I just mentioned. You combine those with the flavorings, the colorings, the emulsifiers, and so on. You get a very profitable food product.
So it's food designed in a lab, in a sense, rather than a kitchen. Lots of different products. Someone said that when you look at the ingredients on the back of a product you get on the shelf, the more ingredients that it has is often an indicator that it's more highly processed rather than kind of simple food that's been created for you.
Exactly. I mean, you go to the supermarket, you pick up an apple. What are the ingredients in the apple? It's an apple, one ingredient. But even if you look at bread, for example, flour, yeast, water, it's very simple. If you pick up a can of processed vegetables like corn or beans, for example, it's typically beans, water, and salt. When you pick up an ultra-processed product, it could contain 25 ingredients.
So these foods have been designed so they're tasty and they're cheap. That sounds pretty good. So what's the problem? What's the health problem around ultra-processed foods?
So when we look at, and this is what we did with the Lancet series, we looked at all of the accumulated evidence on how these ultra-processed foods are impacting on human health. And when you take all of that evidence together, it says something that is very, very clear, which is that if you have more of these ultra-processed foods in your diet, so what proportion of your diet is made up of ultra-processed foods, that associates with a number of health problems. The strongest evidence is for Crohn's disease, which is a form of inflammatory bowel disease, so there's something going on there. We also see really strong evidence for obesity and type 2 diabetes, kidney disease, diseases of the liver, cardiovascular disease, and some forms of cancer. And I should add mental ill health, especially depression. And there's some emerging evidence around things like dementia, Parkinson's disease, and so on. So really clear evidence that there is something going on here.
So what's the science telling us about that? Why do we think we've got these rising incidents of the diseases you outline? We've got rising levels of consumption of highly processed food, but draw the connection to us. What's the science telling us between connection of consuming these foods at scale in high volume and the incidence of these diseases?
Yeah, so there's a few things to unpack there. One is, what is it about these foods that make us eat more of them compared to minimally processed foods? So why do you eat more Doritos corn chips than you would if it was just a cob of corn or, say, like a corn tortilla? You eat way more of that corn chip. And that is a major contributor to obesity and type 2 diabetes. So we think that has something to do with two things about these foods. One is that for every bite that you're taking of an ultra-processed foods, you are packing in much more energy, so many more calories compared to if you're eating those minimally processed foods. And we think that's something to do with when the ultra-processed foods are being manufactured. They are essentially removing the water from these foods and replacing that water with vegetable oils, sugars, these refined starches, and they're very high in energy. So for every bite, you're getting more calories. That's one explanation. Another is that these foods are hyper-palatable. They're ultra-tasty. They're soft in texture, and the softness means we have to do less chewing to consume them. It also impacts on the way they travel through our gastrointestinal system. They're low in protein. And you spoke to Dave Raubenheimer and Steve Simpson about this. Protein dilution is another major explanation. If your diet contains less protein, you're going to eat more food in order to get enough protein for your body. But they also contain these flavorings, these colorings, these emulsifiers, these gums, which make them ultra tasty. And so this again comes back to the business model of the industry. They want us to eat more of the food. So that is the food itself and why we eat more of them and the impact that that has in terms of our calories. But there is much more to that story as well. So when these foods are entering into our gut, we have good evidence now to show that they're impacting on our gastrointestinal system. So emulsifiers, for example, which you will find in many ultra-processed food products, are acting like a detergent in our gut and scrubbing the mucosal lining in our gut, degrading the gut microflora, and leading to something we call leaky gut syndrome. And so this is an inflammatory condition where essentially the ingredients in these foods is coming into contact with our gastrointestinal lining and causing inflammation. That has other impacts. So, for example, our gut microflora produces a lot of things that we need for a healthy brain, for a healthy body. Short-chain fatty acids, for example. We need those for a healthy brain. And when we're eating lots of ultra-processed foods, that system is not working well. And we think that may be what's causing the depression as an example of that.
So if I summarise that, I hear you say that, if you start at the mouth, right?
Yep.
Every mouthful is more calorie dense, which might have weight impact. It's designed so we eat more of it.
Yep.
So we're eating more of this, but the quality of the food, it kind of denuded, particularly of protein. We're eating more. It's designed to be tasty, but the quality of the food is not anywhere near as good. But then once you get to the gut and the gut biome and all the impact that has on health as well, it's not just a volume game, but the quality of that food and emulsifiers could be having a profoundly negative effect on our gut, which is so important to all of our health, including our mental health.
Exactly. And when you look at the evidence on how ultra-processed foods impacts human health, you see that these impacts are affecting almost every major body organ system. So there is something going on here with ultra-processed foods that indicates that we are not biologically adapted to eating these types of foods. We've evolved to eat minimally processed foods, fruits, vegetables, legumes, nuts, meat, dairy, for example. But these ingredients and the way these ultra-processed foods are structured are very new to our biology. And so that's another way of thinking about it.
How did we get here? I mean, I can understand businesses, want to make profits. And I can understand that there is almost like an equity question about making food widely available that is cheap and accessible. But you're talking about significant health consequences of that. Just talk about how this industry has dramatically evolved in the recent decades.
Yeah, so we actually go back in the Lancet series that we just published. We actually go back in history to sort of look at the origins of this industry. How did it begin, and how did it begin to take over food systems all around the world? And it really begins with industrial agriculture, and it really began to take off after World War II. And we had this green revolution, this explosion in food production using in these industrial agricultural technologies. A lot of that came out of the United States, using fertilizer, using mechanization, and pesticides and so on. We could all of a sudden start producing these huge volumes of these agri-commodities, the soy, the palm, the sugarcane, the wheat, the rice, for example. Now, what that did was it had a big impact on global food security. It increased the amount of food we're producing, and food security started to go down very quickly, and that was a good thing. However, it also created this glut of agri-commodities that the ultra-processed food industry could use to make these ultra-processed food products. And that's exactly what we saw. So from the 1950s and 60s onwards, we started to see this industry developing these new ultra-processed food products. And the industry began in the United States and in Western Europe. So these are companies like Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Nestle, for example. But then in the 1980s, something really interesting and remarkable happened. This industry started to globalize very rapidly, and through two main reasons behind that. One is that markets in the United States and Western Europe started to stagnate for these products. In order to continue to grow, the industry had to globalize. So they started to move much more into low-income and middle-income countries.
This is the story of the tobacco industry, isn't it?
It's the same story, yeah. And the other element behind that is financialization. So in the 1980s, we saw these big financial players starting to put a lot more pressure on these corporations to generate more profit. And that was a major driver behind the explosion of ultra-processed foods from the 1980s onwards in particular. So at that moment, we started to see this industry started to really push much more marketing. They started to really globalize much more extensively all around the world. But probably the most crucial thing to understand here is that producing ultra-processed foods is by far the most profitable way of producing food. So there is a lot more profit in a Dorito corn chip than there is in a can of corn, than there is in a cob of corn. And this is well known, right? Value add, valorization. That has major implications, though, in our food system, because in a capitalist world economy, especially one that is highly financialized, the most profitable firms and industries will start to attract the most investment. More profit also means that you can spend much more on marketing the products. You have way more resources to spend on marketing than other types of food producers. You also have more resources to build more factories, to spread your products around the world, and you also have more resources to spend on political lobbying as well, to influence and block the governments from regulating.
And we have, classic and famous examples of that, I suppose. Coca-Cola, the cost of the drink in the can of Coke, probably a matter of cents. You're probably spending several dollars for it. Where's that money going? A lot of it will be going in marketing and in promotion and, in a sense, the distribution of this product to all corners of the world. But the food cost itself, of negligible cost to the company.
Exactly. And Coca-Cola is a great example of that. Listening to Warren Buffett and other investors say how great Coca-Cola is. It's so profitable as a company because basically it can take water, which governments often give to the company for free or with very little cost. You combine that with sugar, another cheap ingredient. You add some flavorings and colorings. There's almost nothing, in the production costs. Put it in a plastic bottle. That doesn't cost much either. There is just a huge amount of resources that you can then spend on marketing the product. And the marketing has a really important goal, which is to drive more consumption of that product. Here we are in the soft drink section. Coca-Cola Classic, 0.5 stars. Once you go to Coca-Cola Zero Sugar, 3.5 stars. So you're replacing the sugar with an artificial sweetener, and somehow that makes it better for you. I'm not buying that. But one thing that ties all of these ultra-processed foods together is the fact that they are wrapped in plastic. These foods also have a really long shelf life, which means that the food is in contact with the packaging for a very long time. Now we know that one of the reasons why ultra-processed foods are harmful to health is because some of the chemicals that are in plastics are leaching into the foods. The phthalates, the bisphenols, and these are known endocrine disruptors. And obesity, type 2 diabetes, these are endocrine diseases, so we think there may be some link here to obesity as well.
Tell us about Australia's story. How do we stack up against other countries when it comes to ultra-processed foods?
So Australia was one of the first countries in the world to have an ultra-processed national diet, along with the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, New Zealand. The latest data we have is from 2011 and 12. Back then, we were consuming about 42% of our diet was coming from ultra-processed foods. At best guess, sometime in the 1990s, our national diet became an ultra-processed diet. I think the best guess is that we're now consuming about 50% of our calories from ultra-processed foods. But when you look at teenagers, that goes up to 60%. When you look at the highest consuming groups in Australia, so the top quartile, that's somewhere around 70-80% of the diet from ultra-processed foods. In the US and the UK, it's up around 60%. If you compare it to countries like France and Italy, it's around 30 to 40%. If you compare it to China, it's only around, countries like China, it's only around 10 to 15%.
So what do you attribute those differences to?
First of all, the companies that I mentioned earlier, they really started to grow in the United States, Western Europe, countries like Australia from the very beginning. So we started to see these foods grow in our diet from the 1950s and 60s onwards. So that's one reason. The other is if you look at our food system and what our food system produces. Australia has a agri-commodity system. We produce a lot of wheat. We produce a lot of sugarcane. We produce a lot of canola oil. And these are base substrate ingredients for the manufacture of ultra-processed foods. But these financial logics, these capitalist logics that I mentioned earlier, these have played out much more earlier in countries like Australia than these other countries that I just mentioned.
So who's doing the management of ultra-processed foods well? And are there countries we can look to and say they are lowering the dependence of their population on these foods over time?
Yeah, so one thing to say is that countries like China, for example, where only 10 to 15% of the diet is ultra-processed, have this great opportunity right now to protect their traditional diets and stop their diet from becoming ultra-processed. So that is a set of policies. And you see countries like Japan and South Korea, for example, implementing these policies to protect those traditional diets.
So what are they doing? Is that through taxation or other forms of disincentives?
It's supporting their traditional food producers and promoting those traditional diets to maintain them and essentially keep the ultra-processed food manufacturers out. But when I'm saying what's an inspiration for Australia, because our diet is already ultra-processed, right? And so we need to actually draw down the share of ultra-processed foods in our diets. Here we can look to countries like Mexico, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, South Africa, and even the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom is far ahead of us in terms of implementing policies that we need and that we know reduce ultra-processed food consumption. And this includes things like taxing the products. And we know if you tax the product, consumption tends to go down. But then if you also add marketing restrictions, if you also have warning labels on the front of the packets, big stop signs that you see in Latin America, which say, reconsider purchasing this food. Mm. If you also combine that with school food programs, which limit the availability of these foods in schools, then consumption starts to drop and drop quite dramatically.
As you've said, there are big businesses behind this, and so marketing and lobbying has been important in the growth of the ultra-processed food industry. How do you see marketing and lobbying from firms really having an impact here?
So the marketing is a big one. And as I said before, these companies can greatly outspend other types of food producers on marketing. They greatly outspend governments as well, by the way. So governments are not spending these billions of dollars on healthy food promotion. We show that in these papers that just three companies, Coca-Cola, PepsiCo, and Mondelez, three of the major transnationals, spending about 13 or 14 billion US dollars a year on advertising alone, which is just one form of marketing. And that's a figure that is 4 times the operating budget of the World Health Organization. So this is an immense amount of power in our food system to shape, what we desire and to reshape food culture all around the world. And if you take Coca-Cola, for example, they're not selling health in their marketing, although they do say, they will make some health claims on their products. What they're selling is happiness. What they're selling is youth. What they're selling is popular culture, sexiness. Marketing by these companies appeals to these social values and these aspirations, and especially those of young consumers. We also see this marketing as appropriating culture all around the world. So the red and white of Santa Claus, for example, Santa Claus used to be green and white. The colors are now red and white. of Coca-Cola.
Attributed to marketing campaigns of Coca-Cola bringing in Santa Claus.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we see the sponsorship of events like the Olympic Games, the World Cup soccer, the cricket, and the AFL here in Australia, again appealing to young people. So marketing and promotion is a very, very powerful way in which these companies drive consumption. Uncle Toby's Roll-Ups. Now this is a product that mimics real fruit. So this is a strawberry flavour fruit roll-up. This is absolutely targeting kids because it comes with tongue prints. These are like a tattoo that goes on the kid's tongue. It's got a cute looking cartoon character. It's got 3.5-star health rating, vegan friendly, no artificial colours or flavours. When you flip it over, this barely contains any fruit whatsoever. Yeah, the main ingredient is maltodextrin, which is something that is extracted from corn. Here we are with probably what is my favourite UPF products in the entire supermarket, which is Sanitarium Up and Go. Marketed as a liquid breakfast, often finds its way into kids' lunchboxes. It is a really quick way for families just to give their kids a product and think they're doing the right thing. It's got a 4.5-star health star rating. That's crazy because this is as ultra processed as you can possibly get. Skim milk powder, maltodextrin, cane sugar, plant fiber, soy protein, vegetable oils, fructose, flavors, gums, stabilizer. Yeah, this is terrible stuff. I would not give this to my kids. Now, this is another thing to say about ultra-processed foods, is a lot of them come in really interesting packaging. And a lot of Aussie kids are getting these pouches, these plastic pouches. And this is contributing to a couple of things. One is children can't actually see the food or smell the food they're eating. It's shutting down the sensory experience of eating food. Second, these are very soft textured. Kids are going to eat them very quickly. Third, they're sieving the food through their teeth as they're sucking on the end of the pouch. And this is a big problem for dental caries. So, yeah, these pouches are bad news. Well, I understand why parents use them because they're convenient. You don't need a bowl, you don't need a spoon. And also children can feed themselves using these. They can squeeze on them. But the best thing parents can do is to make these kinds of foods at home by just mashing up or blending some fruits or veggies themselves. Or if they don't have time, there are products, commercially available products, which you can find in jars, for example, which contain basically the same thing.
You were a co-author of the big Lancet series that came out at the end of 2025, and that's viewed as a crucial step towards a healthier global food system. What's been the response to that series and what's next in that work?
Yeah, so I had the honour of co-leading that series with Professor Carlos Montero, who invented the ultra-processed food concept, which comes from the NOVA food classification. The Lancet series has 3 articles. Those articles cover the science of ultra-processed foods, the policy, what can governments do about it, and the politics of ultra-processed foods, which is what I was talking about, the lobbying, the stuff that these companies do. We also had responses from UNICEF and the World Health Organization as part of the series. They publish articles outlining what they are committed to doing about this problem. There's podcasts, there's videos. Listeners can go onto the Lancet website and read the papers and listen to that content. The Lancet series in the past have been really impactful in setting the global health agenda. So what they tend to do, because the Lancet is the world's top medical and public health journal, what these series do is they generate a huge amount of media attention. This series generated 1,500 news articles all around the world, front page of BBC, New York Times, Sydney Morning Herald, a huge number of news outlets reported on it. So that helps shape the global discourse and tell people, hey, look, we need to pay attention to this problem. But it also these Lancet series also start to generate political attention from governments all around the world. And this is what we anticipate this year. We've already seen the government of Spain, for example, initiating a response to the Lancet series. We've seen the government of San Francisco initiating a lawsuit against the companies, citing the Lancet series, for example. We've also seen the World Health Organization and UNICEF started to mobilize their responses to this problem. And I think we're going to see lots more of this over the year ahead. Now, coming to the question of what's next, we want to organize an even bigger global collaboration of research leaders covering the science, the policy, the political dimensions of ultra-processed foods. But we also now want to get into the economics of it. We want to get into the legal aspects of it. How do we fight back against these lawsuits and supercharge the evidence base behind them? We want to get into the environmental impacts of these products, the plastic waste that they generate, the impacts on biodiversity and land use, for example. And we also want to look at the equity implications. So ultra-processed foods and moving away from them has big impacts for food security. It has big impacts for gender and gender equity. It's not, we can't just, say we need to go back to home cooking without acknowledging that cooking is largely falls on the shoulders of women all around the world. That's something we need to, understand. How do we move towards healthy foods in an equitable way?
So we talked about, global corporations and the reactions of government around the world. Finally, Phil, when it comes to the decisions we need to make as individuals around the food that we are consuming, give us some tips. What do we need to do to be able to eat well in this ultra-processed, food-saturated world?
First of all, become a label gazer. When you're walking through that...
Not navel gazing, label gazing.
Label gazing, That's exactly right. Flip the products over before you buy them. Have a look at the ingredients list. If they contain those ingredients that we were talking about earlier that you would never use, that you don't recognize, that your grandparents would never use. And
I remember that Michael Pollan line. If your grandparents wouldn't recognize the ingredients, it's probably not real food.
Exactly. Follow that guidance. If it claims to be healthy, be deeply skeptical about it. And the other recommendation would be to try and keep these foods out of your household. If they're in your household, they're almost irresistible. I find them irresistible if they're in my household. Chocolate or corn chips or whatever are in the pantry, I'm going to eat them. And most people are the same. So if you keep them out of your house, that's a good way to try and make your diet based on minimally processed foods. Cook at home. Don't be afraid of processed foods. You can still use canned goods, for example. A lot of the foods that we use at home for cooking are processed. And finally is to get political about it. Question these corporations and what role they're playing in our food system. What is our government doing about this? Vote with your fork. Try and buy foods that are not supporting these companies and try and support foods that are being produced by healthy local food producers. But also vote with your vote. Get them behind parties and political leaders that call on your MP and tell them you think this is important. It's important for your family. It's important for our children. It's important for our country. Let's do something about it.
That's Associate Professor Phillip Baker. He's an Australian Research Council Future Fellow and a Horizon Fellow at the University of Sydney's School of Public Health. If you want to dive deeper into the science of what we eat, you'll enjoy our episode with Professors Steve Simpson and David Robenheimer.
If we can minimize the amount of processed foods that come into the house and leave it up to our appetites to do as they've done for the past many thousand years and continue to do in other species, we'll balance our diets using the biology that evolved for that purpose.
You can listen to that episode of The Solutionists right now. If you want to hear how the best minds in the world are tackling our biggest challenges, make sure you follow the show in your favourite podcast app so you don't miss an episode. The Solutionists is a podcast from the University of Sydney, produced by Dead Set Studios.